Naomi Carter knew someone had entered her office when the photograph appeared on the screen behind her, because the only surviving copy had been hidden inside a stitched pocket of her leather notebook for 12 years. The image showed an 18-year-old girl standing beneath a porch light with a faded blue suitcase at her feet, while the closed door of her parents' house filled the background. Beneath it, in red letters large enough for every trustee, reporter, and city official to read, appeared a single accusation. Foundation executive hid family land deals while directing public money. Before Naomi could speak, the speakers played her father's voice from that same night, telling her she had made her choice and would have to live with it. The recording ended, the projector went dark, and Naomi realized the person attacking her had reached into the most private moment of her life to stop a $12 million recovery project scheduled for approval that morning. No one moved until Helen Calloway ordered the technical booth sealed and demanded that every device in the boardroom remain where it was. Ethan crossed toward Naomi, but she raised one hand before he could touch her, more afraid of looking protected than of looking shaken. Two city officials closed their contract folders, while Foundation Counsel whispered that the anonymous complaint included evidence Carter Development owned 3 parcels inside the proposed recovery zone. Naomi had not spoken to David or Angela since they forced her from home, and she had no idea their small Atlanta construction company had survived, much less expanded. Yet the accusation required only one true fact to make every lie surrounding it seem possible. Her parents' business could profit if the foundation funded the neighborhood plan she had designed. Helen moved the trustees into a private conference room, where she asked Naomi whether Carter Development appeared anywhere on the bidder disclosure list. Naomi admitted that her deputy reviewed preliminary conflicts while she focused on community partnerships, then heard how weak the answer sounded. Her deputy had followed policy, but Naomi had created an unspoken rule around her personal history, discouraging questions without ever saying they were forbidden. Ethan asked whether she had seen the name Marcus Carter among the local consortium partners. Naomi remembered a cousin she had not met since childhood and felt the first crack in her certainty. "I did not recognize the connection," she said, and Helen replied that regulators would call that an explanation, not a defense. Security found the inner pocket of Naomi's notebook sliced open, with the photograph and an old birthday card missing. Access records showed that someone had entered her office after midnight using a temporary communications badge. Helen insisted the foundation suspend Naomi until the matter was reviewed, while Ethan argued that removing her before establishing facts would validate the attack. Naomi refused both positions. She requested 24 hours to produce records, identify the source, and disclose any family conflict before the city withdrew. Helen granted the time but warned that the project would collapse if independent answers were not available by 9 the next morning. Outside the conference room, Ethan asked why Naomi had never told him her parents owned development property. She replied that the Carters stopped being her family when they placed her suitcase outside, but the bitterness in her voice exposed a truth she disliked. She had spent 12 years insisting the past no longer controlled her, while carrying its photograph into every important room. Ethan did not challenge the contradiction. He only asked whether someone who knew her history could predict that she would avoid discussing it. Her phone vibrated before she answered. An unfamiliar Atlanta number had sent a photograph of the blue suitcase resting on her parents' dining room table, the handle repaired with the same dark leather stitching she remembered. A second message followed. "Your father did not release the recording, but he knows who did. Come before midnight, without foundation security, or the next file proves you planned the land deal." Naomi looked through the glass wall at trustees gathering their papers and reporters already calling editors. Whoever sent the message knew she feared public suspicion, distrusted her parents, and hated depending on Ethan. The trap did not merely rely on stolen evidence. It relied on Naomi behaving exactly as she always had when hurt, isolating herself until no one could disappoint her twice. She told Ethan she was flying to Atlanta to verify the ownership records, but she did not show him the threat or mention the demand that she travel alone. He studied her face for several seconds, then asked whether there was anything else that could affect the foundation. Naomi said no, feeling the lie leave her before pride could stop it. As she walked toward the elevator, Ethan remained in the corridor, and the distance between them felt less like privacy than the beginning of another decision someone would later regret. The lie followed Naomi through LaGuardia, across the dark flight south, and into the rental car carrying her through streets she still recognized despite 12 years of absence. Her parents' neighborhood had lost several trees and gained newer houses, but the Carter home remained unchanged beneath its porch light. David opened the door before she knocked, looking older, thinner, and less certain than the man who once believed authority could prevent every mistake. Angela stood behind him with both hands pressed together, her eyes filling when Naomi entered, though neither parent reached for an embrace they had not earned. The suitcase rested on the dining room table beside company files and an old cassette recorder. David explained that someone broke into Carter Development's archive 3 weeks earlier, stealing photographs, payroll records, and tapes Angela had made while documenting family birthdays. The recording played in New York came from a cassette left running during the argument on Naomi's 18th birthday. David had forgotten it existed until an anonymous email arrived containing the same audio and demanding that Carter Development withdraw from the recovery zone bid. The sender was Calvin Shaw, a former accountant and minority partner who helped keep the company alive during its worst years. Naomi remembered him as the patient man who reviewed invoices at their kitchen table and brought groceries when Angela underwent surgery. David admitted Calvin had once been closer than family, until an audit uncovered inflated consulting bills routed through a private company Calvin controlled. David forced him out but avoided criminal charges because exposing the fraud would have triggered loan defaults and cost employees their jobs. Calvin kept copies of company files and later joined Northgate Urban Partners, the national developer competing against the Carter Consortium for the same Atlanta land. Calvin's interest was not limited to revenge. Carter Development owned 3 distressed parcels purchased 11 years earlier, when the neighborhood had little commercial value. Northgate needed those parcels to control access roads and assemble the larger development corridor, but David had refused every offer. If Naomi's project failed, Carter Development would lose financing and might be forced to sell. If Naomi resigned under suspicion, Calvin could present the collapse as proof the consortium had depended on family influence. Naomi demanded purchase agreements, financing records, city correspondence, and every email mentioning her foundation role. David stiffened at the tone, accusing her of entering his house after 12 years and treating him like a suspect. Naomi reminded him that he had once decided her future without asking whether she had a safe place to sleep. The argument rose until Angela struck the table with her palm, startling them both. "You can punish each other after morning," she said. "Tonight, somebody is trying to destroy all 3 of us." Angela produced a flash drive Calvin had mailed 2 days earlier. It contained emails suggesting David discussed Naomi's foundation position before joining the consortium. Several messages looked authentic, including one stating that Naomi's work could bring serious capital into neighborhoods larger developers had ignored. David insisted he meant her national model might draw investment, not that she would direct contracts toward him. Naomi wanted to believe him, but memory complicated trust. David had always called control protection when fear made honesty inconvenient. She finally called Ethan and disclosed the threat, Calvin's name, the stolen files, and her parents' property interest. Silence held the line for several seconds. "You told me there was nothing else," he said. "I thought I could establish the facts before this became another Calloway decision about my life. It already affects hundreds of families, Naomi. You did not keep this private. You kept everyone else blind." The rebuke landed because it was accurate and because Ethan did not soften it to preserve her feelings. Naomi apologized, then asked for help tracing the emails. Ethan said he would come with foundation counsel and a forensic analyst, whether she approved or not. For once, Naomi did not argue. David's laptop chimed before the call ended. Calvin had sent a draft press release scheduled for 6 in the morning, accusing Naomi, her parents, and the Calloways of coordinating a land enrichment scheme. Attached were edited photographs, financial tables, and a second recording of Angela begging David not to throw Naomi out. Calvin offered one exchange. Carter Development would surrender its land options to Northgate, Naomi would resign, and the private recordings would remain buried. Angela stared at the screen, devastated not by the threat to the company, but by hearing her own voice choose silence while her daughter stood outside. David said they should transfer the land and end the attack before more damage occurred. Naomi refused, though not because she cared about preserving the family business. Giving Calvin what he wanted would protect them for one morning, and hand him proof that fear still controlled every Carter decision. At 11:47, headlights swept across the front windows. Ethan stepped from a black sedan with 2 specialists and no security entourage, honoring the only part of Naomi's request that still made sense. When he entered the dining room, his gaze moved from the suitcase to the recorder, then settled on Naomi. He did not offer comfort. He placed a laptop on the table and said, "We have 6 hours. This time, nobody decides alone." The forensic analyst began by comparing Calvin's files with Carter Development's archived server backups, while Foundation Counsel contacted the city's Inspector General and preserved every relevant record under formal notice. Several emails had been altered by combining real sentences from unrelated conversations, but one troubling message remained intact. David had told Naomi's cousin Marcus that her foundation role could attract capital to long-neglected neighborhoods, and he had written it before the consortium submitted its bid. The message did not prove coordination, yet it established that David considered Naomi's position economically valuable. David claimed he had followed her career from public articles without contacting her, proud from a distance and ashamed of the reason distance existed. Naomi found the explanation painful rather than comforting. Her parents had known where she worked, celebrated her success privately, and still allowed 12 birthdays to pass without a call. Angela admitted she had written letters but never mailed them because David feared Naomi would reject them. Naomi looked at her mother and said, "You keep describing fear like it made the decision for you." Angela lowered her eyes, and no one defended her. The analyst traced metadata in Calvin's altered files to software licensed by Northgate, but the most recent edits came through a foundation network. Someone inside the Calloway organization had provided bidder lists, Naomi's travel calendar, and the temporary badge used to enter her office. Ethan asked Helen to join a secure call and requested access logs from the communications department. Helen resisted, warning that an internal investigation conducted overnight could expose unrelated donor information. Ethan replied that protecting the foundation now required discovering whom it had already failed to protect. The badge belonged to Claire Benton, Helen's communications director, who answered Ethan's call from her apartment and initially denied entering Naomi's office. Confronted with camera footage showing a person wearing her coat, Claire admitted hiring Calvin months earlier to investigate Naomi after reporters began asking whether Ethan's professional relationship had become personal. Helen had authorized a routine background review, but had not ordered theft. Claire chose Calvin because he claimed inside knowledge of the Carter family and promised discreet results. When she discovered his evidence included stolen recordings, she tried to end the arrangement. Calvin threatened to expose the secret investigation, so Claire provided schedules and access information, telling herself she was buying time. Helen joined the call and insisted Claire acted beyond her authority. Ethan asked whether she had approved examining Naomi's family without informing the board. Helen answered that public foundations could not allow personal relationships to create hidden risk. Naomi expected Ethan to defend her character, but he focused on the decision itself. "You investigated an employee because you did not trust the kind of woman your son might choose," he said. Helen ended the call after warning him not to confuse anger with leadership. Angela remembered Calvin handling Carter Development's insurance claim after a warehouse fire, which led the analyst to old bank records. The regional bank's overnight compliance officer located scanned loan files showing David purchased the disputed parcels with commercial debt 11 years before Naomi joined the Calloway Foundation. There had been no secret investor, foundation money, or agreement tied to her career. The records destroyed Calvin's central allegation, although they did not eliminate the conflict created by Naomi's undisclosed family connection. A separate audit of Calvin's emails revealed that Northgate's general counsel knew he intended to pressure Carter development, but believed he would use zoning challenges rather than stolen family material. Calvin had not begun as a mastermind seeking to ruin Naomi. Years earlier, he had invested personal savings to help David rescue the company and believed he deserved a permanent share of the land. When David discovered his false invoices, Calvin convinced himself that the money represented compensation withheld from him rather than theft. Every later choice grew from that grievance until he could no longer distinguish being wronged from having permission to harm anyone standing between him and what he believed was owed. Police located Calvin at a private airfield after he attempted to meet a Northgate attorney carrying copies of the files. He did not flee when officers approached. He demanded that David explain why loyalty had earned him expulsion, while the daughter who abandoned the business now controlled its future. The accusation revealed how completely Calvin had built his revenge around a false story. Naomi had never controlled Carter development, and David had never accepted that she chose another life. By dawn, Calvin was in custody, Claire had surrendered her foundation devices, and the recordings were no longer an immediate weapon. Yet the emergency board meeting remained unavoidable. The Carter parcels were essential to the recovery plan. David's message created an appearance of influence. Naomi had withheld a threat from Ethan, and Helen's secret investigation had compromised the foundation. They had uncovered the attack, but innocence alone could not restore trust. Before leaving for the airport, Naomi stood beside the suitcase and asked David why he had kept it. He said Angela found it at the bus station weeks after Naomi left, returned by a clerk who recognized their address on an old luggage tag. David repaired the handle, but could never decide whether returning it would look like love or another attempt to control her. Naomi closed the brass latches and said keeping it was still a decision. She carried the suitcase to New York, not as evidence against Calvin, but as a reminder that unresolved harm always found another use when people refused to name it. Naomi entered the board meeting, prepared to lose the position she had spent 12 years becoming qualified to hold. She presented the verified land timeline, disclosed David's message, described the blackmail attempt, and accepted responsibility for failing to recognize Marcus Carter on the consortium list. Her deputy had followed written procedure, but Naomi admitted that her guardedness discouraged colleagues from asking ordinary questions about her family. She recommended removing herself from the project, placing Carter development under independent review, and delaying all land awards until city officials examined the conflict. David called during a recess and demanded that she defend the company instead of punishing it for Calvin's crimes. Hundreds of local workers, he argued, would lose contracts because Naomi wanted to appear cleaner than everyone else. She understood why he was angry, but his fear no longer controlled her answer. "You may deserve the contract," she said. "You do not deserve a shortcut through me." The board accepted Naomi's temporary leave and released a public statement acknowledging the stolen files, undisclosed conflict, and internal background investigation. Helen resigned as chair before trustees could remove her, refusing an immediate apology written by counsel. Northgate was suspended pending review, while Carter Development remained eligible to compete only through a city-led process. The delay caused the recovery plan to miss its federal funding window, forcing 2 permanent clinics and a workforce center to postpone construction. Community leaders responded with less patience than foundation executives expected. At a public meeting in Atlanta, residents accused every institution involved of protecting procedure, while families continued traveling hours for medical care. Lorraine Ellis, who had organized the Neighborhood Coalition for 15 years, told Naomi that ethical leadership meant little if the only visible result was another delay. Naomi explained why temporary programs often disappeared once public attention moved elsewhere. Lorraine leaned across the table and said, "Then build one that cannot disappear." The challenge forced Naomi to confront another habit disguised as principle. She rejected imperfect solutions because she feared becoming responsible for their limitations. Ethan proposed mobile clinics backed by binding construction milestones and a transfer clause placing operating funds under community control if permanent sites failed to open. Naomi initially resisted, then asked Lorraine to help rewrite the plan. Within 3 weeks, 2 mobile units began serving residents, while an independent panel reviewed the land bids. Carter Development failed the first review. Its financing model depended on property values rising too quickly for long-term affordable housing commitments to remain credible. David blamed Naomi, the city, and the public scrutiny before Angela asked whether he wanted fairness or exemption. The question ended their argument because it came from the person who had once supported him through silence. David rebuilt the proposal with housing cooperatives, reduced the company's profit margin, and placed one parcel into a 99-year community lease. The revised plan ranked second financially, but first in local hiring, affordability, and resident oversight. After public interviews, the neighborhood panel selected Carter Development for a limited portion of the work and awarded other parcels to separate firms, preventing any contractor from controlling the corridor. David received less than he wanted, and more credibility than influence could have purchased. Naomi remained on leave for 3 months, while auditors reviewed every grant she had approved. They found no favoritism, but recommended removing conflict checks from executive discretion and distributing authority across regional boards. She returned under those restrictions, accepting that accountability felt different when applied to her own judgment. Ethan welcomed her without implying the crisis had improved their relationship. He had supported her publicly, challenged her privately, and remained angry that she lied before Atlanta. Naomi did not ask him to overlook it, simply because the lie came from fear. Her parents' attempts at reconciliation developed unevenly. Angela called when promised, listened without turning every conversation toward regret, and stopped asking Naomi to visit the old house. David treated each boundary like a temporary obstacle until Naomi ended 2 meetings early. Gradually, he learned that access to his daughter required behavior rather than blood. Helen requested a private conversation, but Naomi declined until the project resumed and community oversight became permanent. Helen accepted the refusal without sending gifts, intermediaries, or carefully worded explanations. For the first time, she allowed another person to decide when a door would open. By winter, the mobile clinics had treated nearly 4,000 patients, and construction began on the first permanent center. The crisis had delayed the plan, reduced its scale, and exposed everyone's weakest instincts. It also produced a structure stronger than the original proposal, not because suffering automatically improved people, but because several of them finally stopped defending the choices that caused it. Angela returned the stolen birthday card during a quiet lunch in Atlanta, sliding it across the table without asking Naomi to read it aloud. The card promised that Naomi would always have a place at home, written 2 years before her parents placed the suitcase outside. Naomi asked how a promise could disappear so completely in one night. Angela answered that it had not disappeared. She had betrayed it. She explained that David's company was near collapse when Naomi rejected the university plan he believed would guarantee security. Angela feared losing the house, the business, and her marriage, then treated Naomi's independence as one more threat she could not survive. When David carried the suitcase outside, Angela chose the frightened man beside her over the daughter with nowhere safe to go. "I spent years saying I was caught between both of you," she said. "Only one of you had money, a bed, and someone standing beside them." Naomi had imagined hearing accountability from her mother, yet the confession brought grief rather than relief. She told Angela that she wanted a relationship, but could not return to being the daughter they remembered. Reconciliation would not restore holidays, childhood trust, or the belief that home was unconditional. Angela agreed and asked what rebuilding required. Naomi answered, "Do what you say. and let time decide what it means. David's progress came through work rather than conversation. He published project costs, accepted resident audits, and stopped introducing Naomi as the reason Carter Development entered national partnerships. When journalists suggested her influence had rescued his company, he corrected them and described the conflict review that nearly removed them from the project. Months later, he apologized for placing the suitcase outside without explaining that he had been scared. Naomi noticed the difference. Helen met Naomi at one of the mobile clinics after spending several months volunteering outside foundation leadership. She admitted ordering the background review because Naomi's privacy, class, and growing closeness to Ethan made her feel the family was losing control. Race shaped the suspicion, Helen said, even when she used safer words such as discretion, stability, and fit. Naomi asked whether Helen would have investigated a white executive from a familiar family with the same urgency. Helen answered no. The honesty did not create instant forgiveness. Naomi said future respect would depend on whether Helen supported shared governance after the scandal stopped attracting attention. Helen accepted the condition and later testified in favor of making the Community Oversight Council permanent, despite advisors' warning that donors disliked losing authority. She never mentioned Naomi during the hearing. Ethan and Naomi rebuilt trust through ordinary disagreements instead of crisis-driven intimacy. He stopped making decisions for her when he believed protection justified speed, while Naomi disclosed concerns before deciding she could handle them alone. Their first date happened nearly a year after her reinstatement at a small restaurant, where Ethan asked what she wanted outside work. Naomi struggled to answer because usefulness had become the safest form of belonging she knew. She admitted wanting a home where conflict did not threaten abandonment, but she feared depending on anyone enough to discover whether such a home existed. Ethan said he could not promise permanent agreement or perfect courage. He could promise that neither of them would use silence to make the other person guess where they stood. The answer sounded practical, almost unromantic, and Naomi trusted it more than reassurance. 2 years after the attack, the National Civic Forum honored the Recovery Partnership for combining private funding, public review, and resident control. Naomi accepted the award beside Lorraine, Ethan, David, and 3 regional directors. She acknowledged her failure to disclose the conflict and her resistance to temporary care, then credited residents for refusing to accept either secrecy or delay as the price of help. For the first time, she accepted recognition without hiding behind everyone else's work. After the ceremony, David gave her the restored suitcase. Inside were the childhood photograph, the birthday card, and 2 library books Naomi had forgotten to return the night she left. David had paid the fees years earlier and later purchased discarded copies from the same branch. Naomi laughed when she saw them, then cried without apologizing for either reaction. Calvin had pleaded guilty months before. In a letter sent through his attorney, he admitted the land dispute began because he believed David erased years of loyalty when he removed him from the company. He never asked Naomi for forgiveness, but he wrote that using her abandonment had allowed him to pretend his own betrayal was justice. Naomi did not answer. Understanding his grievance gave shape to the harm without creating any obligation to comfort the person who caused it. She closed the suitcase and realized that every major relationship in her life had changed only after someone lost the ability to control the story. The future would depend on what they did when no audience remained. The Carter Community Resource Center opened nearly 15 years after Naomi left home, built on land leased to a neighborhood trust for $1 annually. Carter Development completed 1 wing, 2 independent contractors built the others, and residents held a permanent majority on the governing board. No donor could sell the property, rename the building, or remove community programs without public approval. The arrangement was less efficient than the original plan and far more difficult to control, which Naomi considered evidence that it might last. The center was named for the Carter neighborhood rather than Naomi's family, despite reporters repeatedly misunderstanding the distinction. David corrected them whenever they suggested the building honored his company. "We helped construct it," he said during one interview. "The neighborhood owns what it becomes." The restored suitcase stood inside the lobby beside a short card explaining that an 18-year-old once left home with $216 and survived because strangers, shelters, teachers, and public institutions gave her time to continue. Naomi had resisted displaying it, worried that hardship would become decoration for people untouched by its cost. Lorraine persuaded her by asking whether the suitcase belonged only to Naomi's pain or also to every young person who needed proof that asking for help did not make survival less courageous. Angela greeted volunteers near the entrance, while Helen organized registration packets at a table far from the press. Their relationship remained courteous, built through consistent behavior rather than declarations of closeness. Helen had earned one elected term on the Oversight Council because residents valued her governance experience, and she accepted rules preventing her from fundraising or appointing staff. The old Helen would have considered those limits insulting. The woman standing beside the folding tables called them sensible. David arrived late after resolving a payroll mistake at the construction site. He apologized, gave the corrected report to Lorraine, and asked Naomi whether she wanted him included in the ribbon cutting. She invited both parents, Ethan, community representatives, and 2 student volunteers to stand together. No one person became the image of work created by hundreds. After the ceremony, Naomi noticed a teenage girl lingering near the counseling office with a backpack beside her shoes. Maya had left home after rejecting the college major her father selected, and she planned to sleep at a bus terminal until a friend returned from out of town. The resemblance to Naomi's past was strong enough to tempt her into giving an immediate answer. Instead, she asked whether Maya was physically unsafe, contacted the family mediator, and arranged temporary housing while staff documented the threats made at home. Naomi did not tell her to return, and she did not call the father irredeemable. She had learned that protecting someone's choices required more patience than using personal pain as a map for another life. Maya's father arrived later, angry and embarrassed, then stopped speaking when David offered him a chair. Naomi watched her father listen while the mediator explained that financial support did not grant control over an adult child's future. David did not mention his own history or present himself as evidence of redemption. He simply remained in the room when the other man wanted to leave. Naomi understood the gesture, because staying had once been the one thing she needed. At sunset, Ethan found her in the community garden, where young trees stood beside small plaques carrying the names of neighborhood schools. He handed her a brass key attached to a wooden tag engraved with the center's address. "The electronic badge opens the building," he explained. "This opens the garden gate, and facilities will charge $35 if you lose it." Naomi laughed, relieved that he had not turned the moment into a speech. Ethan took her hand and asked whether she wanted to build a life with him, based neither on rescue nor gratitude, but on the habits they had practiced after affection stopped being easy. He did not kneel or produce a ring. He left the question open enough for a truthful answer. Naomi looked through the windows at Angela helping Maya complete forms, David listening beside the mediator, and Helen stacking chairs with volunteers who treated her like any other council member. None of them had become flawless, and no apology had restored what disappeared. They had become more accountable, which gave love somewhere safer to stand. "Yes," Naomi said, "but nobody gets permanent control." Ethan smiled. "That sounds like a foundation policy. It is also a relationship policy." They walked toward the open doors, while the suitcase remained visible inside the lobby, no longer waiting on a porch or carrying everything one frightened girl owned. Naomi had once believed strength meant surviving without the people who failed her. Later, she understood that survival was only the beginning. The harder work was learning which doors deserved boundaries, which people had earned another conversation, and when accepting help no longer meant surrendering direction. She entered the center carrying the brass key, not as a daughter returning to prove her parents wrong, or a foundation leader seeking approval from a wealthy family. She entered as a woman whose worth had remained intact through abandonment, suspicion, failure, and repair. Behind her, the door stayed open for Maya, for the father preparing to hear an answer he might not like, and for every person who needed somewhere safe enough to choose what happened next. The past had shaped Naomi, but it no longer spoke for her. The future would be built through honest records, difficult conversations, shared authority, and promises small enough to be kept. That was not the perfect home she once imagined, while waiting beneath a porch light. It was something sturdier, created by imperfect people who had finally learned that love meant very little until behavior made it believable.